What is Darwin's theory of evolution? Well, there isn't just one theory. We have Darwin's theory, then we have Neo-Darwinian theory, which is the updated version taking into account the advances in the genetics arena, something Darwin knew nothing about. We also have microevolution, and then we have macroevolution. There is also gradualism versus punctuated equilibrium. We'll look a little closer at these later. Generally, the most common version of evolution that is taught is known as gradualism, which is the idea that living things gradually change over time. Darwin believed that natural selection, survival of the fittest, allowed only the best suited, adapted animals to survive in their environment. Those that were not suited to their environment would go extinct. Individuals that were poorly adapted were less likely to survive, and their characteristics were not as likely to be inherited. Over time, the characteristics that helped survival became more common, and a species gradually changes. Given enough time, these small changes can add up to the extent that a new species altogether can evolve. One of the problems with this is natural selection is only a filter. It kills off species and cannot account for new species. Where did all the species come from? Darwin's theory explained how every living thing is connected in a family tree type structure that stretches back millions, even billions of years, to the beginning of life on Earth. This idea is still held by many neo-Darwinian evolutionists today. However, you will see how the evolutionary tree is dead. Craig Venter is no friend of Christian creationists. He received a Bachelor of Science in Biochemistry in 1972 and a PhD in Physiology and Pharmacology in 1975 from the UCSD.
I'm not so sanguine as some of my colleagues here that there's only one life form on this planet. We have a lot of different types of metabolism, different organisms. I wouldn't call you the same life form as the one we have that lives in pH 12 base that would dissolve your skin if we dropped you in it.
Oh, I've got the same genetic code. We'll have a common ancestor.
Well, you don't have the same genetic code. In fact, the mycoplasmas use a different genetic code and would not work in your cells. So there are a lot of variations on the theme.
But you're not saying it belongs to a different tree of life from me, are you?
Well, I think the tree of life is an artifact of some early scientific studies that aren't really holding up. So the tree, there may be a bush of life.
Right. Yes.
Bush. I don't like that word.
But that's only in.
All right, I concede that point. Yeah.
So there is not a tree of life, and in fact, from our deep sequencing of organisms in the ocean, out of now we have about 60 million different unique gene sets. We found 12 that look like a very, very deep branching, perhaps fourth domain of life. That obviously is extremely rare that it only shows up out of those few sequences. But it's still DNA based. But the diversity we have in the DNA world, I'm not so sanguine and ready to throw out the DNA world. I think we're going to, maybe like Richard was saying, we're going to find the same molecules and the same base systems wherever we look.
You, in fact, had a comment you wanted to make, Richard, I think.
Well, it's rather moved on. I mean, I was just going to say I can't imagine why anyone should think it was an ethical problem. I could see why they might think it was a problem of expediency. You might fear that it would, escape and overrun the world or something. But ethical problem, I can't see.
Well,
but I'm now intrigued by Craig saying that he. I'm intrigued at Craig saying that the tree of life is a fiction. I mean, the DNA code of all creatures that have ever been looked at is all but identical, and surely that means that they're all related, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Does the neo or new Darwinian theory better account for the new species that arrive and then is subject to natural selection? This is from a typical Evolution Info website. Note the lack of certainty of these statements on something that is taught in schools as fact. According to evolutions, the physical and behavioral changes that make natural selection possible happens at the level of DNA and genes within the gametes, the sperm or egg cells through which parents pass on genetic material to their offspring. Such changes are called mutations. Mutations are basically the raw material on which the evolution acts. Pobnius said, mutations can be caused by random errors in DNA replication from or repair, or by chemical or radiation damage. Usually, mutations are either harmful or neutral, but in rare instances, a mutation might prove beneficial to the organism. If so, well, don't they know? It will become more prevalent in the next generation and spread throughout the population. There is no consistency in neo-Darwinian evolutionary theory, and often it is contradictory. Remember that DNA is the digital code found in all living life forms that instruct the cell on how to make the different amino acids that form proteins, and then the different tissue types. Given the extremely rare occurrence of a mistake plus the repair processes, it is calculated that the Earth has not been in existence for a long enough time for evolution to have taken place, even if it was true. So how often do mutations occur? About 1 out of every 100 million times a mistake occurs during copying, which can lead to a mutation. We can certainly take comfort in that statistic, as well as the fact that our DNA does a stand-up job of repairing itself when mutations occur. Also, what causes mutations? Mutations can also be caused by exposure to specific chemicals or radiation. These agents cause the DNA to break down, so the cell would end up with DNA slightly different than the original DNA, and hence a mutation. What happens to DNA when a mutation occurs? When a gene mutation occurs, the nucleotides are in the wrong order, which means the coded instructions are wrong, and faulty proteins are made or control switches are changed. The body can't function as it should, and then mutations can be inherited from one or both parents. They are present in the egg and or sperm cells. Let's think about this for a moment. If you had the information, a blueprint or plan for building a house, and let's say that as you started to build a house, the owner wanted to add an annex or an extension to it, would you need to add more information to the plan or less? If I cut a chunk out of the plan or mutated the plan, then handed the plan to my builder, would I have a more complex house or a mutant house? I think you'll agree that what I'll end up with will be a travesty. And the same is true for living animals. Mutations don't have any benefit, although evolutionists quote on the benefits of one mutation, such as malaria resistance by the genetic disease sickle cell anemia. And this one benefit has been hailed as a major example of beneficial genetic selection for over half a century. So is this disease a benefit to the person, and are they more likely to survive in his or her environment? As you can see from this list, you are less likely to get malaria, but you're more likely to die because of these symptoms. If this mutation is such a benefit, why do they bother even treating it? Simply that they want to save the person's life. Okay, let's ask ourselves the question, how do we increase the information in the chromosome, the DNA, so that we can evolve a more complex creature? If you wanted to add more information to a building plan, an intelligent house designer would draw it up for you. So let's ask the evolutionist Richard Dawkins how that happens in living cells, who also said, "You cannot be both sane and well educated and disbelieve in evolution. The evidence is so strong that any sane educated person has got to believe in evolution." So let's see how Mr. Dawkins explains how information is increased in the DNA.
Can you give an example of a genetic mutation or an evolutionary process which can be seen to increase the information in the genome?
Can you just stop when I think...
I'm recording.
Okay. There's a popular misunderstanding of evolution which says that fish turned into reptiles and reptiles turned into mammals, and so somehow we ought to be able to look around the world today and look at our ancestors. We ought to be able to see the intermediates between fish and reptiles, and between reptiles and mammals. We ought to be able to see fish kind of on the way to becoming reptiles. But of course that's not the way it is at all. Fish are modern animals. They're just as modern as we are. They're descended from ancestors, which we're descended from. Way back 300 million years ago, there would have been an ancestor, which was the ancestor of modern fish and the ancestor of modern humans. And that ancestor, if you could have been there then, you could have seen the first steps towards a fish, say, coming out onto the land and becoming something like an amphibian. But that was a long time ago. You wouldn't expect to see that today. And so quite a lot of the misunderstanding of evolution, I suppose, stems from the fact that people are looking at modern animals and thinking that Darwin has said we're descended from them. Well, we're not. We're not descended from modern fish. We're not descended from modern monkeys. We're not descended from modern apes. They are modern animals just as we are. They are our cousins. They're not our ancestors.
Doesn't the fossil record show life forms transitioning into more complex creatures? This picture shows living fossils, animals that are supposedly millions of years old and yet still exist today. This is a quote from the late Stephen Gould, who is a research professor, paleontologist, evolutionary biologist, and historian of science, who was no friend of the Christian worldview, but at least he's honest about the fossil record. The extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as a trade secret of paleontology. Evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference. However reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. Because of the lack of transitional forms, also known as missing links, Stephen Gould had to come up with a different theory which we know as punctuated equilibrium. This theory doesn't require transitional forms because life forms just appear as if by magic and don't leave any fossils. Then we have long periods of time where no evolution occurs. I got a good idea that this is what gave rise to the X-Men series of films. The crazy thing about this is that they're opposing theories. One admits the lack of missing links, the other doesn't. Some say both are true, probably just to save face. Another nail in an evolutionary coffin is something known as the Burgess shale.
Dr. Meyer, we're glad that you're here. And today I want to begin with a clip from Illustra Media's beautiful documentary movie, Darwin's Dilemma, which describes the turmoil scientists experienced when they discovered that the earliest animals in the fossil record appeared abruptly without any evidence of prior ancestors. I want you to watch.
The Burgess Shale was once part of a massive reef in the Pacific Ocean, a haven for a menagerie of life that thrived at the edge of what is now the North American continent. Throughout long periods of geologic upheaval, tectonic forces elevated these rocks and the fossils they bear more than 7,000 feet above sea level. Here, the basic body plans of major animal groups that still exist today, and many others now extinct, made their first appearance in the fossil record so suddenly that biologist Richard Dawkins noted, "It is as though they were just planted there, without any evolutionary history." These fossils gave science its first detailed look at the biology of the Cambrian seas. With computer animation, we can now bring that world to life. First described in 1899 from a fossil found on Mount Stephen, Wiwaxia has also puzzled scientists. This mysterious Cambrian animal is covered with overlapping scales and may have fed by scraping microscopic particles off the seafloor. The animal most frequently discovered at Walcott's quarry was Marella. More than 15,000 fossil specimens of this prehistoric crab have been excavated, most revealing multiple pairs of jointed legs and feather-like gill branches used for swimming. The anatomy of hallucigenia has baffled paleontologists since Walcott first discovered its fossilized remains. 2 rows of sharp spines on its back and more than a dozen needle-thin legs gave the animal the appearance of being upside down, even when it was right side up. At the top of the food chain was Anomalocaris, the undisputed terror of the Cambrian seas. Measuring up to 3 feet long, this super predator used barbed feeding arms to capture both hard and soft-bodied animals. It then devoured its prey with layers of razor-sharp teeth. Between 1910 and 1924, Charles Walcott collected more than 60,000 Cambrian fossils, many of which are still studied in museums and research centers around the world. But the treasures of the Burgess Shale represent more than a wealth of information about ancient life. They are also flashpoints in a controversy that began long before the great geologist ever set foot in the Canadian Rockies.
You know, Dr. Meyer, just looking at that video clip, the animals that were found there, those fossil remains, were really well-developed animals, complex animals. Why did these fossils pose such a challenge to the accepted evolutionary theory about how life originated on Earth?
Well, there were 2 reasons that the discovery of these Cambrian animals created a doubt for Darwin about the adequacy of his own theory, and he acknowledged this in The Origin of Species. The first reason had to do with Darwin's picture of the history of life, the way he depicted life's history. We all remember from our biology textbooks, he represented the history of life as a great branching tree, and the animal tree of life would have had at the top of the tree the first complex forms of animal life, and those forms would have arisen, according to Darwin's thinking, as a result of a series of slow, gradual transformations from some common ancestral form way back in the Precambrian times. But instead of the branching tree picture of the history of life being documented in the fossil record, what we actually see in the fossil record of the emergence of complex animals, is that most of the first complex animal forms of animal life, the major groups of animals, appear very abruptly in the fossil record without any discernible connection to simpler ancestral forms in the lower Precambrian strata. And so you have this contrast between the Darwinian picture of the history of life, which I show in this slide on the bottom, and the actual pattern in the fossil record. And you can see there's a very great contrast between the theory that Darwin put forward of the history of life and the actual evidence in the fossil record. So you have a challenge from the evidence of the theory. The second problem that Darwin recognized, and which also troubled him, was that the Cambrian explosion posed a challenge to his idea about how these animals had been built. He had proposed that the mechanism of natural selection acting on small incremental variations would have acted very gradually and slowly over a long period of time to produce the complex forms of life. But instead, what we see in the fossil record again is the abrupt appearance of these forms of life with no evidence that they arose as a result of a slow, gradually acting process. And so the Cambrian fossil record not only challenged his picture of the history of life, but it also challenged his ideas about the mechanism by which complex living forms would have arisen.
So far, we have looked at 2 main evolutionary theories. I would like now to look at quickly the kind of evolution that Christians agree with, but are often hoodwinked by evolutionists into making you think it's proof of neo-Darwinianism. It's called microevolution. Take the picture on the right. On one side, it speaks of Darwin's theory of evolution, which is the gradualist macro version. But notice the picture. It shows examples of sudden microevolution or an adaptation of species to its environment. Can anybody tell me from the picture what a bird evolved into? It evolved into a bird. This is plain dishonesty. We now know that no new DNA was needed for these adaptations to take place, as the information for differing beak types was already there. It was just a matter of switching on these varying amounts of already existing genes. This is how we get the adaptation or microevolutionary changes in a species. Take all the different breeds of dog, for example. No matter how much you interbreed different kinds of dogs, you only end up with a dog. Finally, before we can even get to the speciation of the planet, we have to explain how life started in the first place. In effect, we've put the cart before the horse. Let's see what a well-respected expert Christian scientist has to say.
I'm a synthetic organic chemist. Origin of life is purely synthetic organic chemistry. There's no way around it. I am perfectly situated to be commenting on this, to be critiquing the origin of life research. It is abiological. It is before biology takes over. This is purely synthetic organic chemistry. And making these compounds is very simple. 4 classes of compounds. You have to make them from what's available on a presumed prebiotic earth. And so the chemistry is not hard for a synthetic organic chemist to follow, and any trained synthetic organic chemist can follow me on this. And I've never seen a synthetic organic chemist disagree with me on this. In fact, the people that might disagree with me are biologists because they've never made anything. The only thing they may have made is they buy a kit and they make it, which is made by chemists, but they've never made anything ab initio. And so it's the synthetic chemist that can critique origin of life research better than anyone else. So go ahead, ask your synthetic chemist friends to listen to what I have to say. If they have anywhere a master's degree or beyond in synthetic organic chemistry, have them critique what I say. We do not know how to build even a simple bacterium. The simplest bacterium with its 256 protein coding genes, we have no idea how to build it. First of all, we don't know how to build the molecules, the 4 classes of molecules that are needed for it. We don't know how to, even if we had those 4 classes of molecules, assemble them even into the simplest of bacteriums. We don't know how to do that. One can do that with the technologies we have today. We can make technologies, but we can't even make the simplest bacterium. Anybody who would say something contrary does not know what they are talking about. Show me the demonstration. Nobody has ever done it. And it's not because of lack of effort. It's not because of lack of will. First of all, they haven't been able to get the molecules to do this. And if they could make the molecules, even if we were to give them the molecules, they wouldn't have the information. There would be no inherent information in the DNA. But even if we gave them the DNA in the structure that they wanted, they wouldn't know how to put all the components together because of the sophistication within a cell. The interactomes, meaning that the interacting connectivity between the molecules, the van der Waals interactions, all of these have to be in the right place and in the right order for a cell to function. We don't even know how to define life, let alone knowing how to spark it to begin.
Random, undirected causes cannot possibly account for the origin of life. So how simple is the so-called simple cell?
In
In 1957, Francis Crick first proposed that chemicals called bases along the spine of the DNA molecule function as alphabetic characters in a written language or digital characters in a machine code. This animation shows how this digital information directs protein synthesis. First, a large protein complex separates the tightly wound strands of the DNA to prepare it to be copied. During this process of transcription, a protein complex called a polymerase produces a single-stranded copy of the original instructions. Here we see this copy, a messenger RNA molecule, being constructed inside the polymerase as individual bases are positioned and added to the growing strand. Now we see the polymerase in action from the outside as it spits out the messenger RNA transcript. Next, this RNA transcript approaches and passes through a molecular machine called the nuclear pore complex, an information recognition device that controls the flow of information in and out of the cell's nucleus. Now we see the genetic assembly instructions on the messenger RNA approaching and arriving at a two-part chemical factory called a ribosome, the site of protein synthesis. As the messenger RNA transcript passes through the ribosome, the process of translation begins. During translation, a mechanical assembly line builds a specifically sequenced chain of amino acids in accord with the instructions on the transcript. These amino acids are transported from other parts of the cell by molecules called transfer RNAs, which link specific sequences of bases to corresponding amino acids. The sequential arrangement of the amino acids determines the type of protein constructed. When the construction of the chain is complete, it is transported to a barrel-shaped machine that helps fold it into the precise shape required to perform its function. After the chain is folded into a protein, it is released into the outer cytoplasm to do its job in the cell.
One last thing, here are the mathematical odds of life occurring from non-life. Essentially, all scientists agree that if an event has less than one chance in 10 to the 50th power of happening, that is 10 with 50 zeros after it, we can't realistically expect that the event has ever occurred or will ever occur, unless totally unexpected or undetected factors are present or introduced. The mathematical odds are calculated to be less than one chance in 10 to the 282nd power. That is a million, trillion, I guess you get the idea, exists that even one such life-supporting body would occur anywhere in the universe without invoking divine miracles. The estimate for the number of particles in the universe are 10 to the 90th power. The odds of life occurring spontaneously are 10 to the 282nd power. Atheists say they like them odds. That is, folks, ridiculous. While Dawkins says you have to be insane not to believe in evolution, do we really believe that frogs will turn into princes or human beings given a sprinkling of time and random unguided processes? Or do we believe in an intelligent designer? The answer to the origin of life, the Lord Jesus Christ. John 1:3-5 states, all things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. Thanks for listening.